Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Just wanted to get right into it today. I was doing some research on the two witnesses of Revelation 11 and I came up with some interesting stuff and also just some things I wanted to say about the book of Revelation in particular. And this kind of stemmed from a long debate I had with a wannabe recently where the wannabe continued to, push the Revelation 20 narrative. In other words, Revelation 20 explains it all. It's crystal clear. There can be no confusion. How can you be so dumb, DaCosta, for not taking Revelation 20 for everything that it says? Yada, yada, yada. So me sitting there on the opposite end of that, it's kind of scratching my head like, is this guy serious? He's taking Revelation 20, particularly the point that it says about the first resurrection. He's going there for his proof texts and clinging to that, all the while ignoring all the crystal clear proof texts that I'm showing him from the portions in the New Testament that are a hell of a lot easier to understand than Revelation chapter 20, mind you. But nope, that wasn't acceptable to him. He preferred to stick with Revelation 20, and his main argument was the first resurrection argument. But I wanted to just make a note on this first resurrection thing. And it's kind of funny because all these guys actually argue that the first resurrection occurs in AD 70 or occurred in AD 70 at the coming of the Lord. This particular guy that I was arguing with was a partial preterist. So he's just a half futurist is all that is. The partial prets, I was one for about 3 weeks until I got real and realized that everything occurred right there at the coming. But these partial prets usually like to say that, yes, Jesus did come back in AD 70. Yes, he did destroy Jerusalem. Yes, he did judge them for their works. Yes, there was somewhat of a resurrection, but this was the first resurrection, not the final. That's what they say. So according to this man, AD 70 was the first resurrection of Revelation 20, and then sometime in our future there will be a final resurrection of the rest of the dead. But that's wrong on a whole number of fronts, and I explained it to him, and those of you who have been around my channel for a while know that I beat that argument into the dirt. That's one that the old Joseph, what was his name? Joseph Simpson. Joe Simpson used to make when he claimed we were doing violence to the text. But yeah, we beat that into the dirt so bad it wasn't even funny. But this guy thinks that AD 70, again, he thinks that AD 70 is the first resurrection. But if we just look at Revelation 20, that argument goes completely away because it doesn't even say that. It actually says the exact opposite. So it says this, it says, "And I saw thrones," this is verse 4, "and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection." So, folks, I don't know if you picked up on that, but Revelation chapter 20, verse 5 and 6 literally say that when the rest of the dead are raised, that's the first resurrection, right? Now, I know you're kind of scratching your head like, what are you talking about? Well, just listen closely to how it's worded and catch it in its flowing context. There actually isn't even a resurrection of the martyrs there, right? He saw thrones. These individuals sat on them. Judgment was committed to them, okay? And then it's sort of like a new vision, right? It's not, that first sentence there in verse 4 is about thrones and they sat on them and judgment was committed to them. So, if you know anything about Revelation, you know it's just different visions coming at you from all different directions, right? It changes, right? We have these little breaks and titles and headers in our Bibles that say like Satanic Rebellion crushed and stuff like that. But that's not how it was originally written, right? Those are not there. So you never know exactly, or you don't know exactly what vision is coming at you at what time. So you have to be really careful. As a side note, in my opinion, you cannot take anything that the book of Revelation says to strict wooden literally because it's incredibly symbolic. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a moment. It lumps entire freaking centuries, 1,000-year periods. It lumps everything into one jumbled mess. And it's really, really confusing. So what I suggest you do with the book of Revelation is you take the frameworks that it gives you. You look at the clear things that it gives you, such as the time statements. 21 times the book mentions that all the events were about to take place. I mean, how many more times could the author use words of imminence to push his point forward that literally they were on the cusp of this stuff taking place? As another side note, when you're reading the book of Revelation, you need to understand that it's about events that already took place, events that were taking place, and events that were shortly to come to pass. It's not about any events 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 years in the future. It's about events that took place in the history, events that were taking place, and events that would shortly come to pass. And that's basically it. So when we look at this, okay, we have to be very careful. We have to keep things in their proper context. We can look at the identity of certain individuals if it gives it to us. For instance, Revelation 14 gives us a dagger on a silver platter and says, and no one but the 12 tribes could sing the redemption song because they were the ones redeemed from the earth. So right there we know that the 12 tribes Revelation 14 does give a definitive statement that's pretty tough to argue. Right? And there's other things in the book that show that only the 12 tribes' names written on the city, stuff like that. Right? Who was getting the sealing of the Holy Spirit? The 12 tribes of Israel. So it gives you those looks into it. But as far as taking anything in a chronological order or trying to argue for a first resurrection, you shouldn't do it, right? Because it's very, very difficult. But just look at what it says here. It says, and I saw thrones and they sat on them and judgment was committed to them. Okay, so verse 4 to me matches what we know that Jesus said to the 12 disciples. He said, you'll sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So when I read verse 4 here, I see, and I saw thrones and they sat on them and judgment was committed to them. Okay, that matches pretty perfectly. I think that's the 12 disciples judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he changes it and he talks about something different. He says, and it's the same verse 4, he says, then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. So interesting. He sees thrones and these individuals sit on them and they begin to judge. Then he sees the souls of those who have been beheaded, right? So he sees martyrs. So he's seeing two different groups of people. He doesn't exactly say that these martyrs even had a resurrection, honestly. He just says, then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness and for not worshiping this and that and not receiving the mark on the forehead or the hand. And they lived with Christ and reigned for 1,000 years, right? So they lived with Christ and reigned for 1,000 years. It really doesn't, if you think about it, it doesn't say anything about a first resurrection. It doesn't say anything about any resurrection. But that's not even the most important point to pick up on. Look at what verse 5 says. Verse 5 says, but the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Okay, so verse 5 is exactly what I just said to you. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. So what was the first resurrection? It was when the rest of the dead were raised. Incredibly odd, right? Incredibly strange. But that's exactly what it's saying. It's not jumping back over verse 5 and going back to these martyrs and these souls of the martyrs who he saw living and reigning with Christ and saying that's the first resurrection. No, he's saying that the first resurrection was when the rest of the dead lived again after the 1,000 years were finished. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. Okay, so I hope you're picking up on that, because what that does is that eliminates all arguments from bozos like this partial preterist. Because A, it shows that the rest of the dead were raised at the first resurrection. The first resurrection was not the first resurrection. If we're taking it in everyday human language, like first meaning first and first implying there's going to be a second. No, it doesn't mean that. If the rest of the dead were raised at the first resurrection, then the first resurrection is the only resurrection. Or it's the final resurrection, I should say. And we know it is because it says, blessed and holy is he who has part in that first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. And we see that the second death was going to take place at the coming of Christ when he would destroy death in Hades, and those who didn't make it would be cast away. That was the second death. So that all tied in with the AD 70 coming of Christ. But it's just interesting because we can't really, you can't really take that for what it says. You have to kind of get into that wacky symbolic mode and just say, okay, clearly this doesn't mean first like we would think first means. Okay, maybe it's a translation error, who knows? But clearly, if the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished, then that means that it's over at the first resurrection, because it says this is the first resurrection. Okay, now I know you're going to laugh and mock and scoff, and some of you will say, oh, first means it's last now, right? Well, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with what the book says, because that's precisely what it says. Go read it. Revelation 20, verses 4 and 5. Read it in flowing context, and you'll see clearly that the rest of the dead are raised at the first resurrection. Okay, and my opinion is that AD 70 was the final resurrection of all those who are Christ. It was the judgment of the just and unjust. It was about to happen, like Paul said in Acts 24. And so, of course, that is the rest of the dead being raised right there in AD 70. Which means, folks, that those souls of the martyrs who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and who were ruling and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, they were already up there. They were already up there at some point prior to that final resurrection in AD 70 at the coming of the Lord. They had to be. But of course, we're dealing with a wackadoodle fairy tale type story, so we don't get all those bits and pieces of information. It doesn't fine comb detail that for us, okay? So yeah, just wanted to mention that. But we're going to bounce back over to Revelation 11 because I want to take a look at this, and I want to yes, today I'm actually at a computer, so I have a little bit more ability to check shit out. Let's just get right into it. Verse 1 and 2 of Revelation 11. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside of the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, to the nations maybe. And they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So very clearly, folks, verses 1 and 2 is a picture of measuring the temple. Okay? It's a 42-month trampling of that temple. They will tread the holy city. Obviously, we know that's the temple. That's Jerusalem. Tread it underfoot for 42 months, 3.5 years. Okay? Verse 3 introduces the 2 witnesses. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So we see that these 2 witnesses are receiving power to prophesy, and they're prophesying during that same 42-month period. 1,260 days is 42 months, 3.5 years. And the author wants us to understand that those 2 periods are tied together there clearly. So the 2 witnesses are prophesying during the final 42-month Jewish war where the Temple of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Okay? Now, we have some problems. And this is what I mean about Revelation. You're going to see here in this chapter that this is all over the place, and none of it makes any sense whatsoever, especially when held up to what we see elsewhere in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically. A lot of this stuff is just like bonkerdoodle, ham and banana sandwich, okay? Look at verse 4. It says, these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have the power to shut up heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And they have power over waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. So, folks, verses 4 to 6, clearly, without any doubt, these 2 witnesses are Elijah and Moses. There is no question about that. People like to make endless videos about who they are and what they are. In fact, I might even have an old video where in the beginning I didn't quite understand it. But yes, this is Elijah and Moses. Clearly we see that these 2 witnesses have the power to shut up heaven so that no rain falls. We know about the drought that Elijah called down. We know that it says they have power over waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues. We know that Moses struck the waters and turned them to blood, and he struck the earth with all plagues. Obviously, nobody needs to go back to Exodus to see that happening. So we know that this is Moses and Elijah, okay? And as a side note, we see that those are the two characters in the transfiguration of Matthew 17, right? Excuse me, it's Moses and Elijah being pictured as glorified heavenly beings, okay? So the two witnesses, in my opinion, are Moses and Elijah, all right? If we look at, okay, so wait, let's make a side note. So as of right now, we have the 3.5-year period of the war, the trampling and the destruction of the Jerusalem and the city, the not one stone left unturned that Jesus talked about. And we now have that tied to Moses and Elijah prophesying during that same time, right? It's got to be. Who else can fit that bill? Who else can fit the power to shut up heaven so no rain falls? Who else can turn water into blood and call down plagues upon the earth in the story? Nobody can, right? There's no other accounts of anybody doing those things other than Elijah and Moses. So it has to be them. But then you say, well, that doesn't make sense because this is, the last 3.5, 42 months of before the supposed coming of Christ, right? At the destruction of Jerusalem. How is Moses and Elijah there, right? How are they prophesying during that last 42 months? Okay, it's very, very confusing, right? But look at what verse 7 says. It says, when they finish their testimony, the two witnesses, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, and where also our Lord was crucified. So we see in verse 7 and 8 that they're finishing their testimony. The beast kills them, okay, overcomes them and kills them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which where the Lord was crucified. We know that's Jerusalem, clearly. So they die. Wait, but I thought they were already dead, right? We're dealing with Moses and Elijah. So how are Moses and Elijah alive and being killed by the beast? It says the beast is going to overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street. So clearly they've now died a second time, right? And then if we look in verse 9, it says, then the people from the tribes, tongues, and nations will see their bodies for 3.5 days and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. Okay, so the beast kills them. They're already supposed to be dead. Verse 9, they die and lie in the streets of Jerusalem for a period of 3.5 days, which is interesting, because, of course, we were talking about 3.5 years. One has to ask, is the 3.5 days that John uses here, is it supposed to be another way of describing the 3.5 years, the 42-month period that he just mentioned in a couple paragraphs earlier? Possible, very possible, right? But what is he doing calling 3.5 years, and then 2 paragraphs later calling 3.5 years, 3.5 days, right? This is what I mean. Revelation is banana sandwich. So when you start harping upon the 1,000-year reference in Revelation 20, I just kind of laugh because there is no reality here. This is like acid type stuff. This is like magic mushroom type stuff. So these ones are lying in the middle of the city for 3.5 days, and nobody's allowing their dead bodies to be put into graves. Now, that's interesting because if you look at the Gospels and the account of this last days period in Acts and whatnot, we don't have any mention of this, right? We don't have any mention of Moses and Elijah, these two great prophets, lying in the street for 3.5 days. Nor do we have any mention of them lying in the street dead for 3.5 years, right? So that kind of eliminates that, right? Based on a lack of evidence. I mean, unless we're supposed to believe that this actually took place at some point and nobody wrote about it. No historical reference whatsoever. No mention of it in the rest of the New Testament. Moses and Elijah dead, right? That doesn't make much sense. But look at verse 11. Now after 3.5 days, the breath of life of God enters them, and they stand on their feet. Great fear falls on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, come up here. And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In the same hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. In the earthquake, 7,000 were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third is coming quickly. So in verse 11, these two prophets, after those 3.5 days of lying there with their dead carcasses, whatever that means, they ascend up into heaven in a cloud, right? People see them. All their enemies see them. And in the same hour, there's a huge earthquake that destroys 1/10 of the city and kills 7,000 people, and the rest were afraid. So what in the hell is going on here? Right? So let's recap. So we have a designated period of the 42 months where the city is going to be trampled. Okay, now, I don't know about you, but that has to fit the Jewish-Roman war. It has to fit the 3.5 years leading up to the final destruction of the temple. It's a rough estimate. Stop trying to put dates on it. You're a bozo. Okay, there's nothing exact here. These are all just, generalized periods of time and statements. Okay, this is craziness in Revelation. You cannot follow this logically if you're honest. Okay, so we have that period. Then we have the two witnesses prophesying for that same 1,260-day, 42-month period. So during those 42 months, wherever they were, I contend they were the last 42 up until the trampling of the city, we have to have these two witnesses prophesying in the city. It's got to be Moses and Elijah. Point me to one other person that does what's described by these two olive trees and two lampstands. Okay. Now it's interesting that if we look at Matthew chapter 27, we can see in the resurrection there, in the death of Jesus, where he gives up the ghost, it says that some of those who stood there, when they heard Jesus cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? They said, this man is calling for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge and offered it to him. The rest said, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So, very interesting scene there in Matthew 27, where we have Jesus dying on the cross. Well, first off, they predict that he might be calling for Elijah. So that's kind of interesting. That's a little tie-in to Elijah here, okay? And there's a couple of them. But he's calling for Elijah. He dies. He gives up the ghost. And then it says, after his resurrection, the veil of the temple was torn in two. The graves were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city. So it appears to me, and you could read it for yourself, but this scene in verses 51 to 53 actually takes place after the resurrection of Christ. Christ raises, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, or maybe that happened at the death of Christ. I don't know. It's pretty confusing. But what's interesting to note is that the bodies don't come out of the graves until after after his resurrection. And then they go into the holy city and appear to many. Check out verses 52 and 53 of Matthew 27. And take note that the bodies are not coming out of the graves until after Jesus rises. Just something interesting to take note of, because I think a lot of people believe that the dead bodies popped out of the grave when he died. But no, that doesn't happen. They pop out after his resurrection, which would make sense because he was the first fruits of the resurrection. So you would think that he would be first in order. Although who knows with this wild story. Okay, so just something interesting to note, that's exactly what we see taking place in Revelation 11 to a degree, right? We see bodies coming out of graves. We have these ones who are given the breath of life. These two witnesses, God breathes life into them after 3.5 days. What's interesting is that Jesus received that life after about maybe 3.5 days of being in the tomb. So could it be there's a weird, wacky correlation there where, because we know that the saints would rise after his resurrection, so were these dead bodies lying in the street, Elijah and Moses, for a period of 3.5 days when Jesus was in the tomb? And then they rose after he rose, and then they went into the city? Well, I mean, Revelation 11 says they rise after 3.5 days, and many are afraid of them in the city. They go into the city, right? And then they ascend up into heaven. Interesting. They ascend up into heaven. But notice there's the big earthquake in both places, too. You have the Matthew 27 earthquake when these ones, when he dies or when he raises, when he comes out of the grave. And then in Revelation 11, we have this massive earthquake, which kind of correlates to a rising as well. So could it be that some of Revelation 11 is pulling from Matthew 27? Possibly. But what did I just show you, folks? Well, I showed you that there's literally no way for all of this to be true in real time, real space. You have a period of the 42-month destruction, the trampling of the city. You have two witnesses during that 42 months, unless Revelation 11 switches from the 42-month trampling to a different period of 42 months where the two witnesses were in action. I mean, that's an option, but it seems unlikely because in that context, it seems like what he's saying is during the 42-month, this is perhaps where Satan was loosed for a little while. During that last period of utter destruction, it seems like the two prophets are, unleashing destruction, or they're terrorizing people in the city, or I don't know. But we have the two prophets, the two witnesses prophesying for the same 42 months. It gives us the definition of who they are. Elijah and Moses, no doubt. We see Elijah and Moses in the Transfiguration glorified as heavenly beings as they looked up into the heavens. So clearly we know there's some kind of connection to those two because it wants you to see that. And it just makes no sense. Then the beast, so they're tormenting the city, right, for 42 months. Then the beast kills them, even though they were already dead, because Moses and Elijah died centuries earlier, many centuries prior to this event or this period. So the beast kills them for a second time. Then they're lying dead in the streets of Jerusalem for a period of 3.5 days, right? I don't know, they were around for 3.5 years, and then they killed them and lie in the street for 3.5 days. I mean, you see what I'm saying? This is why Revelation needs to be handled with care and not taken too strict wooden literal, because it's all over the map. And then they rise again after 3.5 days, right? And they're alive again for a third time. And they ascend up to heaven in a cloud as angelic beings. But wait a minute. If this was during the 42 months at the end, and they're ascending at some point at the end, then how did they get there in the Transfiguration? Because remember, before Jesus dies, some 30, 35 years before this, they see Moses and Elijah in heaven, right? They have the vision of Moses and Elijah in heaven. So they were already in heaven. Then they would have come down for the last 42 months as living beings. You see how crazy it is. It's very crazy. And you shouldn't be holding this stuff, taking it to heart. Like it's like every word is gold and it should line up and it's got to make sense and everything. I'm the biggest guy for making sense of the story, yes, because you can actually formulate the framework. You can see the borders, the timeline very clearly. You can see what it was all about, who it was for. You can see the elect, the mission for them, the Holy Spirit. It makes a lot of sense in that regard. But we're talking the land of make-believe here, folks. So you can't be too specific about things. You have to let it be what it is, and that is a story, a fanciful fairy tale type story. And this is especially true when we get to the book of Revelation, because everything's jumbled, mumbled, mixed up, and wackadoodle in the book of Revelation, as I just clearly showed you. Okay? I mean, heck, I showed you in the beginning how the first resurrection, or what's called the first resurrection, is actually the rest of the dead rising in Revelation chapter 20. So, folks, when someone's arguing that, the 1,000 years ends here or the 1,000 years ends there, and we're in the 1,000 years now, which is a bunch of crap, you just got to tell them, like, dude, you're a moron. Just flat, plain and simple, because if anyone is formulating a position based upon a text or a passage or a chapter in Revelation, they do not know what they're doing in the Bible. They just don't, because it's just, there's no real order to a lot of it, right? Most of Revelation is what I just showed you. It's just sort of flashing in and out of different time frames and different characters and putting them together, and it's just crazy. So, just wanted to share my thoughts on Revelation 11, Matthew 27, and a little bit of that first resurrection nonsense. We're just under 30 minutes, so we're going to cap it here. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope it got your mind spinning a little bit and thinking. Give it a like, please. It really helps out, and we'll catch you on that next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.